A Tuesday morning in January, Ottawa, the kind of cold that turns breath into smoke before it leaves your mouth. Prime Minister Mark Carney stands at a podium inside the Lester B. Pearson Building, Canada's Foreign Affairs headquarters, and announces a trade deal. Not with the United States, not with Europe, with China. He speaks for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. He uses no dramatic language, no raised voice, no prepared applause line. He simply describes the terms. A reduction in tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6.1%. An expansion of Chinese access to Canadian canola, and a structural shift in the North American economic architecture that no one in Washington had anticipated. The White House did not have a prepared response. The State Department did not issue a briefing. A senior Trump administration official, speaking off the record 2 hours later, used 3 words to describe what had happened. 3 words. And those 3 words have since been confirmed by 2 separate journalists and quoted in a congressional hearing. We will get to those 3 words. But first, you need to understand that what Carney announced that morning was not a trade deal. It was the first move in a 3-part strategy that has quietly outmaneuvered the most powerful economy on Earth. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that makes this the most important geopolitical story of 2026 that most people are not fully tracking, is that none of the 3 moves involved a single raised voice, a single public threat, or a single dollar in retaliation. Subscribe right now and hit the bell, because what I am about to walk you through is the most methodical, precise, and economically devastating use of strategic positioning in the modern history of North American trade. And once you understand exactly how it works, you will never look at the Canada-US relationship the same way again. Before we get to the 3 moves themselves, you need to understand the exact dimensions of the board on which this is being played. Because none of this makes sense unless you first grasp what was actually at stake. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade pact that governs the largest integrated economic zone on the planet, covers more than 500 million people. It accounts for 30% of global gross domestic product. In 2024, the total value of goods and services traded across those 3 borders reached an estimated $1.93 trillion. Not billion, trillion. Canada specifically was the United States' single largest trading partner in 2024. Not China, not Germany, not Japan, Canada. $2.7 billion in goods and services crossed the U.S.-Canada border every single day. The Bureau of Economic Analysis had documented that trade relationship contributed an estimated $1,840 in annual purchasing power to the average American household. 64% of the crude oil entering U.S. Midwest refineries came from Canada. 412,000 jobs in the American automotive sector depended on integrated supply chains running through Ontario and Quebec. Canadian pension funds held over $1.4 trillion in U.S. sovereign and corporate debt. Canadian banks were the 3rd largest foreign holders of U.S. Treasury securities. The president had called this economy a frozen joke. He had suggested it survived on American generosity. He had proposed on 17 separate occasions that Canada should simply become the 51st state. And for 26 months, Canada had absorbed every one of those statements, every tariff escalation, every public humiliation, and had said very little in return. But here is what those 26 months were actually for. They were not for absorbing punishment. They were for building something. 3 things specifically. And by January of 2026, all 3 were ready. The first thing Canada built was an exit from American economic dependency. A door it had quietly been constructing for over 2 years. A door it opened on January the 16th by signing a trade deal with the country America feared most. The second thing Canada built was a legal tripwire. A 43-day countdown that, if not resolved, could begin the dismantling of the very trade agreement Trump himself had once called the greatest deal in American history. The third thing Canada built was the most unusual economic weapon in modern history. It required no legislation, no executive order, no central bank coordination. It was built entirely out of the private decisions of 38 million ordinary people. Let me show you how each one works. Move 1. The China deal. On January 16, 2026, Mark Carney flew to Beijing. He had not announced the trip publicly more than 48 hours in advance. He did not hold a joint press conference with Chinese leadership. He did not pose for the kind of ceremonial photograph that signals a state visit designed for domestic audiences. He arrived, conducted 4 sessions over 2 days, and announced a bilateral trade framework on his way out of the country. The terms were specific. Canada would reduce its existing 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles to 6.1%. Matching its standard most favored nation rate for an initial annual quota of 49,000 vehicles. That quota was structured to grow to 70,000 over 5 years. In exchange, China would reduce retaliatory tariffs on Canadian canola oil from 84% down to approximately 15%. It would lower barriers on Canadian pork, Canadian seafood, Canadian peas. And China committed to direct investment in Canadian electric vehicle manufacturing capacity. The White House response arrived in stages. The first stage was confusion. No briefing had been scheduled. No diplomatic heads-up had been offered. The U.S. Trade Representative's office issued a statement calling the deal concerning, a word that in diplomatic language means we were caught completely off guard and have not yet decided how to be angry about it. The second stage was warning. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy appeared on camera and told reporters that Canada would regret the decision, that any Chinese electric vehicle entering Canada would be barred from crossing into the United States, even for visits. Read that again, even for visits. A Trump administration official had just announced that a car, a physical automobile owned by a private citizen, would be legally prohibited from driving across the most economically integrated border on Earth. That announcement cost the American automotive argument approximately 15 years of credibility in a single sentence. Here is why. The Ford Motor Company's own chief executive had stood on stage in 2023 and called Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers an existential threat to the North American auto industry. He was not wrong. BYD had just overtaken Tesla as the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturer. Geely, NIO, and Great Wall were building vehicles at a cost basis so far below anything Detroit could match that the gap had stopped being a competitive disadvantage and had become a structural impossibility. And the United States, the country that had imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs specifically to keep those manufacturers out, had just watched Canada open a door. Not a wide door. 49,000 vehicles out of Canada's annual new vehicle market of approximately 1.8 million is less than 3%. But it was a door. And the markets understood what a door means in a trade war. It means the wall on the other side did not hold. A Michigan Democratic Senator, Alyssa Slotkin, flew to Toronto within weeks. She sat down with Canadian officials at the Global Progress Action Summit and delivered a warning about cybersecurity risks from Chinese vehicles sending geolocation data back to Beijing. The warning was legitimate. The visit itself was the more important signal. A United States senator had traveled to Canada to ask, politely but urgently, for Canada to reconsider a deal it had already announced. Canada did not reconsider, and the deal's second dimension was the one that American observers had not fully absorbed by the time the media cycle had moved on. China would invest in Canadian electric vehicle production capacity, not sell cars into Canada, build the infrastructure to make them there. Legacy North American automakers, Ford, GM, Stellantis, had spent decades building their deepest manufacturing knowledge in internal combustion engines. Their EV divisions were competitive but behind. Chinese manufacturers had built their production maturity in electric first. The investment provision in the Canada-China deal meant that Canadian participants in the supply chain, the same supply chain that feeds the American automotive sector, would have direct access to that knowledge. The Trump administration had called Canada a frozen joke. Canada had just arranged for its auto sector to go to school with the people who were beating everyone else. The White House did not update its statement. Move 2, the USMCA freeze. Most people know there is a deadline approaching. Fewer people understand exactly what it means, and almost nobody is reporting on the specific asymmetry that makes Canada's position in the next 43 days so unusually powerful. Here is the mechanism. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement contains a mandatory joint review built into Article 34.7 of the agreement itself. On July 1, 2026, 43 days from today, all three countries must agree to extend the pact for another 16 years. If any single party declines to confirm extension, the USMCA does not immediately collapse, but it enters a 10-year annual review cycle. Each year that review fails to produce agreement, the clock runs down, and on July 1, 2036, the agreement expires entirely. This is not a cliff, it is a slope. But it is a slope with a very specific starting point, and that starting point is 43 days away. Now here is what the reporting has mostly missed. The United States has been conducting active trade negotiations ahead of this deadline. 2 full rounds of formal bilateral discussions have been completed. Progress has been made on supply chain integration, content requirements, and trade structure. Commitments have been outlined. Frameworks have been agreed in principle. None of those 2 rounds involve Canada. Every single one involved Mexico. The United States government, with 43 days remaining until the most consequential trade deadline in North American history, had not scheduled a single formal round of negotiations with its largest trading partner. Not one. No date had been set. No framework had been proposed. The U.S. Trade Representative's office had indicated that issues would not be fully resolved by July 1. Let that sit for a moment. The country that called Canada a frozen joke, that imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, that threatened the Canadian dollar, that suggested Canada should simply cease to exist as a sovereign nation. That country was now, apparently, content to arrive at the most important trade deadline of the decade, with its largest trading partner having received no negotiating process whatsoever. There are 2 possible explanations. The first is that this is a deliberate pressure tactic, what William Allen Reinsch, a former Undersecretary of Commerce, described publicly as classic Trump bullying. Maximal demands, threats to withdraw, chaos as a negotiating instrument. In this reading, the absence of talks is a performance designed to force Canada into a concession position before formal negotiations begin. The second explanation is more unsettling. It is that the White House genuinely believes Canada needs this deal more than America does. That Canada, faced with the prospect of a collapsing USMCA, will quietly capitulate and accept whatever terms are eventually offered. That the silence from Washington is not a tactic. It is a reflection of how Washington actually understands the relationship. If the first explanation is true, Canada's response is already written. Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, told a Chamber of Commerce audience that the July 1 date was not a breaking point, that the agreement would not collapse if issues remained unresolved, that Canada was prepared to negotiate and had time to do so. Measured, precise, not panicked. If the second explanation is true, if Washington genuinely believes Canada needs this deal more, then what has happened over the past 26 months has not yet been fully priced by the American side. Consider the structure of what Canada has constructed. 15 free trade agreements covering 51 countries, a bilateral trade framework with China, active engagement in the CPTPP, the Indo-Pacific Trade Partnership, as a potential bridge between European and Asian markets. A domestic manufacturing investment strategy that had been quietly accelerating since the first round of tariffs in February of 2025. A currency that, despite being called monopoly money with snow on it, remains the 6th most traded on Earth and is now held as a reserve asset by 38 central banks. And a population that, as of the most recent polling, believes Canada should reduce its dependency on the United States by a margin of 91%. 91%. That is not a political faction, that is a national consensus. And a national consensus of that magnitude does not produce concession, it produces patience. And patience in a negotiation with a 43-day countdown is the most dangerous asset either party can possess. Canada has it. Washington, with a trade representative who has confirmed that issues will not be resolved in time, does not appear to. The second move was not to threaten to walk away from USMCA. The second move was to make clear, through the accumulation of 15 trade agreements, one China deal, and a settled population, that Canada could walk if it needed to, and that the cost of walking, while real for Canada, was no longer existential. That is a different Canada than the one that signed the original agreement in 2020. Washington has not updated its model. Move 3, the one nobody reported properly. No government issued it. No legislation authorized it. No diplomat coordinated it. No central bank cleared it. It emerged from the private decisions of ordinary people, spread through social media and kitchen table conversations, and has now become what one industry executive described as the most sustained, most economically damaging voluntary tourism boycott in modern North American history. Here are the numbers. In 2024, Canadian tourists spent $20.5 billion inside the United States. $20.5 billion. That spending supported an estimated 140,000 American jobs, according to the U.S. Travel Association. Canadians were not just America's largest trading partner in goods, they were America's largest source of inbound tourism by a significant margin. Then the tariffs came. Then came the 51st state rhetoric. Then the Canadian dollar was called monopoly money. Then a border crossing between Windsor and Detroit, a crossing used by 40,000 people a day, became the subject of extended detentions, civil rights concerns, and a Canadian government travel advisory recommending that citizens be aware of their rights at the American border. And 38 million Canadians, without a single coordinated instruction from their government, simply stopped going. The numbers are extraordinary. Canadian road trips to the United States fell 35% compared to March 2024, before the trade tensions began. Air travel fell 14% year over year in March 2026 alone. That was the 14th consecutive month of year-over-year declines. Not a spike, not a protest. A 14-month sustained structural withdrawal. The U.S. Travel Association updated its projections. It now forecasts $5.7 billion in lost international tourism spending for a single year, a decline it attributes largely to the collapse in Canadian visitor numbers. Dallas, Texas, which had seen Scotiabank, Royal Bank of Canada, Bank of Montreal, and CIBC all open regional offices in recent years, reported a nearly 50% year-over-year drop in Canadian visitors. Not leisure tourists, business travelers too. Grand Rapids, Michigan, a city that had just named Vaughan, Ontario as a sister city, reported a 53% drop. Vermont, 30%. Las Vegas. The mayor of Las Vegas, a city that received 1.4 million Canadian visitors in 2024, had publicly begged on camera for Canadians to come back. Not to a government, not to a trade negotiator. The mayor of an American city stood before microphones and said directly to the people of another country, "Please come back. We love you. We need you. We miss you." Air Transat suspended every single U.S. route for summer 2026. Every one, not reduced, suspended. WestJet cut U.S. capacity by 19%, Air Canada by 7%. Flair Airlines reduced U.S.-bound seat offerings by 58%. Duty-free shops at the U.S.-Canada border reported sales declines of between 40 and 80%. One border shop owner in Surrey, British Columbia told reporters his business had dropped over 80%, and he was now running on a skeleton staff of 3 to 4 people, down from 20. And the most important number, the one that tells you this is not a temporary mood. 70% of Canadians surveyed in early 2026 had no intention of traveling to the United States that year. Not 50%, not a slim majority, 70%. And alongside the Canadians who stopped going south, a domestic boom was quietly building. Canada's tourism sector generated nearly 60 billion Canadian dollars in revenue between May and August 2025 alone. A 6% year-over-year increase and a record high. Canadians were not traveling less. They were redirecting. London received trips that would have gone to Orlando. Mexico absorbed the snowbirds. Families who had defaulted to Florida were booking Disneyland Paris, Banff, Tokyo. The money did not disappear. It left the United States and went somewhere else. And here is the line that Amir Alan, the president and CEO of Longwoods International, a travel research firm, delivered to Forbes magazine. He said, "Tourism boycotts do come up over one issue or another, but in my 37 years in the travel industry, I have never seen anything like what the Canadians have pulled off. This is one that's being felt, and it's not going away quickly. 37 years, never seen anything like it. This was not organized. There was no boycott committee. There was no government campaign. There was no hashtag that started it. There were 38 million people who had been called a frozen joke, whose currency had been called monopoly money with snow on it, whose prime minister had been called a clerk in a sweater, and who had quietly decided that their $20 billion a year was going somewhere that treated them with respect. That is not a political protest. That is a market correction." Now add it up. Move 1 produced a structural crack in America's EV containment strategy. It opened a door in the Chinese automotive wall that the United States had spent 5 years and billions of dollars in tariffs trying to hold closed. It redirected Chinese manufacturing investment into Canadian supply chains. And it signaled to every other trading partner on Earth watching this conflict that the American alliance network was not offering better terms than Beijing. Move 2 placed a 43-day countdown on a trade agreement covering 30% of global GDP, with the country that called Canada a frozen joke having conducted 0 formal negotiating rounds with Canada and no confirmed date to begin. The U.S. Trade Representative has already told reporters that issues will not be fully resolved in time. The countdown is running. Washington does not appear to be running toward it. Move 3 withdrew $5.7 billion in projected annual tourism revenue from the American economy in a single year. Removed Canadian air capacity from U.S. routes across 5 major carriers. Drained 50 to 80% of revenue from border trade businesses in New York, Michigan, and Vermont, and produced a 50% visitor drop in Dallas, a 53% drop in Grand Rapids, and a Las Vegas mayor publicly begging for customers he no longer had. None of it required a press conference. None of it required a military posture. None of it required Canada to say a single threatening word. The governor of Michigan, the mayor of Las Vegas, the CEO of Ford, the U.S. Travel Association, and a Democratic senator from Michigan all said the same thing in different ways across different months. This is costing us, and we are not sure how to stop it. They were not commenting on a trade deal Canada had threatened. They were commenting on moves Canada had already made, completed, irreversible. The 43-day USMCA countdown is the only move still in motion, and Canada has not blinked. There is a concept in long-term strategic negotiation that experienced analysts call structural patience. It is the condition in which one party has built enough alternatives that waiting costs them less than it costs the other side. It does not require aggression. It does not require public confrontation. It requires only that you have done the work in advance that makes waiting affordable. Karen Chappell, director of the School of Cities at the University of Toronto, described the tourism data in May 2026 by saying it was indicative of a beginning of a shift that could continue. She was careful, measured, academic, but her word, continue, was the one that mattered. The U.S. Travel Association had predicted a return of Canadian tourists to the U.S. The Business Development Bank of Canada then surveyed 1,000 Canadian adults. 70% had no plans to cross the border. The prediction was wrong. The structural shift was real. And structural shifts, once embedded in behavior, culture, and infrastructure, once airlines have cut routes, businesses have redirected supply chains, investors have rebalanced toward Canadian and European assets, do not reverse because the political weather improves. They reverse when the underlying conditions change. The underlying conditions have not changed. Here is what these three moves taken together actually say. They say that for 26 months, while Washington described Canada in terms no allied government had used toward another in the post-war period, Canada was not absorbing punishment. It was building optionality. Every trade deal signed, every diplomatic relationship deepened, every tourism dollar redirected, every free trade agreement expanded. Each one moved Canada one step further from the position where American goodwill was a structural requirement. Canada is not yet fully free of that dependency. The 43 days ahead will test how close it has come. But the three moves already made, the China door, the USMCA clock, the $20 billion withdrawal, have already answered the question that Washington apparently believed it did not need to ask. The question was, what happens when you call your largest trading partner a frozen joke for long enough that they decide you were right about one thing, that they were too dependent on you? The answer is what you are watching right now. Sovereignty is not declared, it is built, move by move, deal by deal, $20 billion at a time. Tell me in the comments what you think Washington has actually understood about these 43 days, because there are two possibilities. The first is that the silence from the U.S. Trade Representative's office is a tactic, pressure before the final push to a deal. The second is that it is not a tactic, that it reflects how Washington still sees Canada. Drop your answer below.